Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast. Yes, I'm popping back into your ears just one more time before the break, because in the first days of 2024 I had the chance to talk to Peter Schmitz, producer, researcher and presenter of the podcast Adventures in Theatre History, Philadelphia. I'm always pleased to see a new episode from Peter land on my podcast feed, because he always has a good theatrical story to tell and delivers it with tremendous verve and enthusiasm. Peter certainly likes to delve into the detail. His podcast is littered with fascinating stories, big and small, from the highways and byways of Philadelphia theatre history. But for our conversation, I persuaded him to give us a more general overview of theatre in Philadelphia, from how it got started to the present day. And he was keen to point out the many links, in some cases one might say the dependency, on British and more generally European theatre throughout. So please join us now on a journey through theatre history, Philadelphia style. Where do you say that theatre really started in Philadelphia? How far back do we go?
Conventionally, one talks about professional theatre in Philadelphia. If you look at any textbook, you're starting about the year 1754. You're starting in the mid-18th century. But in my mind, I always look at the fact that theatre was forbidden. And the reason it starts in 1754, which is rather late, some 80 years after the city was founded, and even, the Swedes had been here before the Brits got here, and the Lenni Lenape long before that, was why was theater not here? Why was there no theater in Philadelphia? And it's not an interesting or irrelevant topic, because famously, Philadelphia was founded by Quakers, was founded by William Penn. And the Society of Friends. Now, it wasn't only Quakers that were here, but they certainly formed a majority of the population for most of the early 18th century, and their ways of doing things tended to predominate. And one of the things that the Society of Friends really didn't like was the theater. And they shared this anathema of the theater with other Protestant groups of the time. And, famously, you're just getting to the part in your own podcast when theater is forbidden in London itself during the mid-17th century, during the Commonwealth. And that's because the Puritans essentially were in power. And theater was something that had bugged them for a long time, since Shakespeare's day, right? And when they finally got their hands on things, that was one of the first things to go. They tore the theaters down, and of course it snuck back in, and you're going to cover all that. But that was the formative years of young William Penn's life. He's the son of Sir William Penn, who was a big figure in the British Navy, and the fact that Sir William Penn switches sides during the course of the Commonwealth and joins the King Charles and loans King Charles a great sum of money. Means that King Charles II is completely in William Penn's debt, literally. And to pay off this debt, he gives him this huge grant of land in North America, make Penn's Woods. So when he sets up the government of Pennsylvania, and he specifically, in the first founding document, it specifically forbids the showing of plays, which is lumped in with a bunch of other things, bear baiting, bullfights, cockfights, gaming, dancing, all sorts of. But it's not just that they thought it was immoral and irreligious, although they certainly did. But to the Quakers' point of view, who were a radically egalitarian sect, theater was a place of social distinction. Theater was a place where rich people got better seats, and people wore fancy clothes to show how rich they were. And to the Quakers, who all dressed in plain black, and who used the informal thee and thou instead of the formal you, all these things were not the way they wanted their new society to be like. They wanted people to be industrious. They didn't want holidays. They didn't want times when you would take off work and go entertain yourself. If you weren't, working, you should be praying. That was or reading the Bible. And that sort of feeling permeated the cultural air in Philadelphia for most of its early years. Now, it wasn't the only American city like that. Boston, for instance, famously, which was more controlled by Congregationalists and actual Puritans, forbid theater itself there too after 1730. And there were other, mainly New England parts of the North American colonies were like that. Not in Canada, where the French were happy to do plays, and not down in Spanish-speaking areas of North America, and not in Virginia and the Carolinas, which were controlled by Church of England types, planters who were very pro-theater. George Washington, as we learned, loved going to see plays. He was of that class. He first goes to see plays in Barbados when he takes a trip there as a young man, and falls in love with the theater. And after that, goes to see plays whenever he can, and he could fairly often, because these traveling groups of English players had arrived in America by then and were putting on plays in Williamsburg and in Annapolis and so forth. So he was pretty well versed in the modern European, or at least British, repertoire. But in Philadelphia, it was a little harder to get things going. And we note that in the early 1750s, this group of British players comes over called the Halams. Now, Hallam, if anyone is a specialist in 18th century British theater, they would know that's a name of a theatrical family. They had pretty wide influence in London and in provincial theaters at the time. And the thing that you find is that in England and most of Great Britain in the mid-17th century, there were restrictions upon the theater in London in particular. There are only two major houses, right? There's official houses, patent houses, where you could where you could do plays, spoken plays, Covent Garden and Drury Lane. And that means that there were a lot of these theatrical families who couldn't find work, right? And so they started to branch out and look for new markets. And some of them were working in Bath and in Dublin and in other provincial cities. But inevitably, some of them started to join this migration along the eastern seaboard, especially to the West Indies, where the biggest money was, down in Jamaica and Barbados. But some of them started coming to the cities along the Atlantic seaboard, even places where they weren't necessarily welcome. They were testing out new markets. And interestingly, one of the things that happened in Philadelphia, if you study early American history, you know that part of the complaint that the colonists had against the mother country was that you couldn't manufacture things here. You had to only take manufacturing from England. Couldn't make plates, you couldn't make anything. You couldn't bring tea, famously, yourself. You had to accept it from the East India Company. And one of the things that the British Parliament kept doing was knocking down all these local laws against theater. Because again, to their mind, that was a restraint against, exports from the home market. We're going to send you plays and you'll bloody well like it. And so every time one of these colonial laws against the theater would come up, the home office would knock it down and say, no, it's allowed. You can bring plays. And so in 1754, this group, the Hallam Company, comes and they set up shop in a warehouse along the riverfront. Now, Philadelphia at that time is only a town of maybe 20,000 people or so. So it's not London. It's not Paris, not by any stretch of the imagination. It would be a smaller provincial town. But it was a completely new territory. And it turned out that there were lots of people in the city who were eager to be part of the larger intellectual and social environment of the Enlightenment. And they saw theater as part of that. So when we look at the plays that were done in the 1750s and 60s by these touring companies they never stayed in Philadelphia long. There wasn't enough people to make it a permanent home. They would move to New York and down to Williamsburg and down to Charleston and then to Jamaica. They would do the standard British repertoire. They brought about a couple dozen plays. There were about 20 people in the company, and they would do restoration comedies and adaptations of Shakespeare and comic operas and sentimental comedies, especially moral comedies that taught valuable lessons. Those were really popular here. Originally, they would do their plays in a warehouse in Philadelphia. It was Mr. Plumstead, a former Quaker, had a big warehouse down by the Delaware River, and he offered it to this theater company, and they set up a stage on one end, and it proved that there was a audience of people who were interested in that sort of discourse. And there was a prologue which one of the actors said, they would write these special prologues, of course, before plays. That was famous in the 18th century for the occasion. This was reported in the Gazette, which was Benjamin Franklin's paper. And it's pretty clear to me that Benjamin Franklin was pro-theater. And I think he was subtly encouraging the fact that Philadelphia should join the rest of the world. So this actor gets up to speak this prologue, which says, "To this new world, from famed Britannia's shore, through boisterous seas where foaming billows roar, the Muse, who Britons charmed for many an age, now sends her servants forth to tread the stage. The world's a stage, where mankind act their parts, the stage a world, they show their various arts." So it was like, join the world, join the party. You can't hide yourself in this special little Quaker world anymore. And on the whole, Philadelphia begins to become a home for theater, but they can't build a theater within the city limits proper. It's kind of like London. I mean, in Elizabethan London, you have to build your theaters on the other side. Well, that's what they did here too. In fact, there was an area of town called Southern, really? Which was just at the right, and that was where they built the first theater, just as Shakespeare did in his day. Yeah. So, and then it gets more. I skip over the 18th century part of the story pretty quickly in my podcast because I'm not as fixated on the 18th century. I'm a 19th century man by training, so I'm always sort of hurrying through the 18th century to get to the 19th century, and that goes against the main grain of what most people think about when they think of Philadelphia and they think about history. They want to talk about the 18th century because they want to talk about the Continental Congress. They want to talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitutional Convention. And even today, that's mainly how Philadelphia markets itself,
Absolutely, because it was absolutely central to the revolution and the establishment of the new country.
Of course. Yes, it was. But I would point out that while all that was going on, the Continental Congress had banned theater. Had officially, this was one of the first things they did, was in order to stop the people from being distracted by useless and time-wasting pursuits. They forbid them from doing theater. They forbid American Army officers from going to the theater. They thought it was a terrible waste of time. That sort of Protestant mindset was very widespread then. And it wasn't until Philadelphia becomes the capital of the United States, and that may not be widely known elsewhere. It's not even a widely known fact in America that Philadelphia was the capital of America for 10 years, from 1790 to 1799. It was a famous compromise. Most people, if you know your history of America in the 18th century from the musical Hamilton, as I think many people do, what's interesting is that Philadelphia is completely written out of the story. It's hardly mentioned in the musical. He moves everything to New York, and New York was briefly the capital, but it soon shifted to Philadelphia and was for 10 years. And because George Washington had been elected the first president, and George Washington liked plays, well, they were going to do plays. He made it clear. I came across something in a book today, an excellent book, which is all about American presidents going to the theater. It explains something that I've noticed when I look through newspaper archives and I see an ad for a play that's being staged in Philadelphia about 1790, 1791. And it says at the top of the ad, it says, "By particular desire." Well, this book just explained to me that the particular desire was George Washington's, that he wanted to see this play. It was kind of like a royal command. Yeah. So it was a hint to all of the other theater goers in Philadelphia that President Washington will be there. And if you want to be in the room where it happened, you had to go see that show because by particular desire, President Washington was going to be in the house that night. So in the 1790s, George Washington's favorite actor, a guy named Thomas Wignell, broke off from the old American company, the remnants of this Hallam Company that had been one of the premier companies in the America and then in the new country for about 3 decades. He had broken off from it and founded his own company, which he called the New Theater. And he builds a new theater on Chestnut Street right next to the Continental Congress, right next to what's now Independence Hall. And George Washington, favors him with his, one of the first subscribers is General Washington. So that really settles the whole effort. The Pennsylvania legislature is, even before that, is forced to repeal the ban on theater. Philadelphia, for about 20 years, becomes the premier theatrical market in America. Now, there were, of course, still were theaters in New York, and now there were ones in Boston, and there were ones in Richmond and in Annapolis and Charleston and Baltimore. So it's not the only place that theater is happening, but for about 20 years, it's the main theater. It's the most prestigious theater. It's got the most talented people. But the people who are working in this theater are almost entirely English, almost entirely British actors. Mm-hmm. And there are very few native-born Americans who are involved in the theater. And there's this odd transformation that I know keeps happening. People from these old acting families, they're born to it, darling. You couldn't expect anyone else to know about it. You had to be one of the old families. Some of the Kembles, and certainly the Wignells and the Hallams and the Woods, they come over here and they sort of become American, but not all the way. They're still doing a very standard British repertoire. There are French plays in there, which are translated, of course. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of French people in Philadelphia, especially after the Haitian Revolution. A lot of French emigres arrived in Philadelphia from Saint-Domingue. But it's mostly in English, and it's really sort of a reflection of London tastes, and plays by Bickerstaff, and plays by John O'Keefe, and plays by Sheridan, as well as old restoration comedies. Thomas Otway, are part of the standard repertoire and what everybody wants to see. And the American theatrical taste, which we can see in Philadelphia in the late 18th and early 19th century, is very shaped by the European mindset. Even in this new American country, there is no there's occasional attempts where somebody writes a play and they say, oh, this is finally an American play, and maybe set an American topic, but it's very much in an English style. It uses, the acting companies are set up on English lines, the way they're organized. It's just like a British acting company, as opposed to a French or German.
Do you have a view on why that was? I mean, is it that the audience they're appealing to is mainly people who don't have any animosity towards Britain post Revolution?
Well, that is part of it. Yeah, the certainly George Washington and the Federalists, although he just, of course, ran a rebellion against the British rule, but soon after that's all settled, as soon as American independence is established, the upper classes and the ruling classes of the American establishment, on the whole, are fairly pro-British, and there is certain conflict going on between those who are pro-French, Thomas Jefferson versus Hamilton. Again, if you,
right.
I refer you to the musical. Yeah. But once the French Revolution goes badly, and once Napoleon takes power, that all sort of goes away. So the tastes of the classes and the male class, because it's mainly men who establish playgoing and playgoing tastes at the time, is fairly pro-British, and there isn't a lot of distinguished the American playwriting at the time. So it takes a while. It takes a good long while. And it's not until a Philadelphian, Edwin Forrest, actively begins to commission plays by American authors and to assert a sort of American primacy, and actually takes those plays back to London in the 1830s and 40s, that a American style of theater begins to even develop. And along with the developing of minstrel shows, which I also have a whole episode about minstrel shows in Philadelphia, begins to export now what is American back to Europe.
So our English actors who are turning up in the 18th and 19th centuries, are they finding theatres that they would feel were comparable to London?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. The most famous example of it is the New Theatre, which I mentioned at the beginning. Now, it's often called the first Chestnut Street Theatre because it was on Chestnut Street here in Philadelphia, but no one called it that at the time. It was the New Theatre because it had replaced the Old Theatre, which was down in Southwark. And the New Theatre was brought over by Thomas Wignell, again, an English actor, who cousin of the Hallams, who had gone back to London. He had gotten all these investors in Philadelphia, and gone back to London, had bought scripts, had bought music, and had hired actors, and had gotten architectural plans for this new theater, which was kind of based upon the Covent Garden Theatre. It wasn't as big,
Okay.
but its basic outlines were the same. So it was basically a standard British stage, which with a large four-stage, and two entrance doors, on either side, and then upstage were the groove system where flats would be brought, back and forth
yes.
For the scenery, and you didn't interact with the scenery behind you. All the acting was done down on the four-stage. So that was absolutely standard British production values. And they often would do quite spectacular scenic effects, but they were usually reproducing things that had already been done on British stages.
Right,
and even circus artists, which came over. I talk a lot about the popular circuses, which played in Philadelphia in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And they were doing routines that had been established at Astley's Circus in London or at the Circus Franconi in Paris. These would have been completely familiar routines and situations to the European audiences at the time.
That whole story of circus and minstrel vaudeville shows really entwines with the story of what we might think of as straight theatre. Everything is coexisting in the same ecosystem in the city, isn't it?
Right.
Was there a constant stream of British actors coming across the pond, or is it the same actors coming back again because they find success there? Well,
the thing happens then as now. If you're a British actor, nowadays you do sort of have a dream. Oh, I'd love to go to America and really make a big money.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, that was the dream then too. So some actors come over, they stay a few years, and then they make a good pile of money, and they come back. Or some don't make any money and they have to stay, or they have to go back in poverty. But we begin to see, with the arrival of sort of faded British stars, first is George Frederick Cooke, this huge star of the London stage, who was basically fired from Covent Garden because he was a terrible alcoholic and he showed up drunk too many times. And he gets sort of shanghaied by one of these other British expat actors, Thomas Cooper, and gets thrown onto a ship in Liverpool. And 45 days later, he dries out and he wakes up in New York and finds out that he's the most famous person in America. And people are desperate to see his shows. When he comes to Philadelphia, there's practically a riot at the box office because everybody wants to see the famous George Frederick Cooke. Now, no one really knows that name today. I tell a great story in the podcast about what happens he dies a few years on, and what happens to his mortal remains, which are eventually buried when another famous British actor who people might know, Edmund Kean, shows up. And Edmund Kean thought that George Frederick Cooke was his idol. So when he arrives in New York, he makes sure that George Frederick Cooke's remains are suitably buried. He raises a huge monument above him. He steals one of his finger bones and takes it back home to London and puts it on his mantelpiece. But then Edmund Kean does the same thing. He tours throughout America, introduces the curtain call, by the way, to the American stage. First happens here in Philadelphia at the Walnut Street Theatre, something that had been unknown on the American stage, that once you're dead, your character is dead. Richard III wakes up, stands in front, and takes a bow, and there's more clapping. Many people are like, what is that? It may have been a French thing, because I note in the memoirs of some actors that this is a French habit that we really ought to be stamped out right now. We can see actors like Cooke and Kean and Fanny Kemble and William Macready, and on into Sir Henry Irving, and even continental stars like Sarah Bernhardt coming to America in order to make a big killing, to make as much money as they can, then bring it all back home. Some of them stay, like Fanny Kemble ends up marrying a local Philadelphia boy and living here much longer than she wants to, as it turns out. Some end up going home. But Philadelphia, in particular, becomes up until about the Civil War, is a major place for market for all these European artists to tour and arrive at. The great French actress Rachel comes through Philadelphia. in the was it 1840s? Yeah, she catches a terrible cold backstage at the Walnut Street Theatre, from which she never really recovers, and she can't go on. But meanwhile, the Philadelphia audience doesn't understand her French, stuff anyway, and they're throwing things from the balcony. It's terrible, terrible. But Philadelphia is no longer, by this point in the narrative, the center of things. And by which point I should explain that I don't want to claim that the story that I'm telling is the most important story in theater history, because it certainly isn't. I've backed way off the main road. I've gone down a side road here, and I'm talking about a very particular city that's a major American city. It's for most of the 19th century the second largest city in America, but by the end of the 19th century, it gets surpassed by Chicago, and it slowly falls back down in the list every time I look up. But it becomes a place because I think of this early prominence in American theater, it maintains a really fervent theater-going audience. And I must say, from this point on, every time I read about either American acting company or a European acting company arriving into Philadelphia, they all remark about how amazing the audiences are here, how passionate they are, how interested they are to be at the theater. And even though an ideological antipathy to the theater remains amongst some religious types, on the most part, Philadelphia theatergoers remain really avid and passionate and interested. And it's always a great town to play. So everybody from Oscar Wilde to the great Italian opera singers to I've already mentioned Henry Irving, but make sure that they stop in Philadelphia if they're going to. Of course, they'll go to New York, because by this point, New York is the major theater town. You're going to go there first, make that the focus of your. But they're going to stop by Philadelphia, and something interesting always seems to happen here. I always end up with an interesting story about any touring European star that ends up coming through town. One of the things you may remember is that I talked in particular about censorship campaigns that happened in the early 20th century, right? This antipathy to theater sort of resurfaces in the early 20th century when there's all these moral crusades about morality. And people are especially freaked out about the arrival of what's going on in films, in the cinema, this new thing where all sorts of immorality and drinking and licentiousness and irreligion can supposedly be seen. And that bleeds over into the live theater as well. So I have a number of episodes which focus on the absolute shock and alarm when an American, he's a German immigrant, again, it's Oscar Hammerstein, builds an opera palace in North Philadelphia and stages the Strauss opera Salome, with the text by Oscar Wilde, right? And that sets off a tizzy of moral alarm. And there are people, screaming around the papers, threatening to close it down, to forbid the production. And of course, everybody shows up to see it. Because again, the reason people get so upset about things is because they're so excited about them. And they don't want to admit how excited.
It's publicity.
Yeah. There was great publicity. It always is great publicity. But at times, things really would get shut down, including Sarah Bernhardt, coming through town on one of her last tours, is forbidden to put on the play La Samaritaine, which is a biblical drama by Edmond Rostand, which she had done for years in the theaters of Paris and in London, everywhere else. But somebody gets a bee in their bonnet that it's an irreligious play, that it shows Christ on stage, and that's wrong. You can't do that. I don't know, Christ has been on stage since the Middle Ages, so I don't know what they suddenly thought this was a new thing. I guess some of them were upset because they thought that Sarah Bernhardt herself was going to play Jesus, and they thought that had to be stopped.
A bit too far, yes.
Right. And of course, that wasn't what the play was. She was playing the Samaritan woman. It's the name of the play. So it actually does get banned. And that's right before. And now something that might be known, and I know this, it might be known elsewhere. My son was recently he was in college a few years ago, and he spent a semester abroad in Dublin. He went to University College in Dublin, and he took a course on Irish dramatic literature, I'm proud to say. And he mentioned that the professor of that course sort of perked up and said, "Oh, you're from Philadelphia. Well, that's the place where they got upset about the Playboy of the Western World, and they threw the actors in jail," which isn't quite true. But it is true that they did Lady Gregory and the Abbey Players from Dublin did get arrested for staging Playboy of the Western World, and the local Order of Ancient Hibernians, using a Pennsylvania statute, which was active at the time, could make a citizen's arrest and could haul them up before the court for presenting an indecent play. I mean, it was all thrown out of court immediately. They didn't end up being horribly persecuted, but it made the news. It got around, and once again, Philadelphia had a reputation in most of the early 20th century as being a sleepy, a judgmental, a censorious, and a blue-nosed kind of place where nothing interesting was going to happen. That reputation maintained for most of the early to mid-20th century.
Yes, in one of your recent episodes, you point out that joke, I think it's in 42nd Street, where they're joking about Philadelphia being a boring town to go to.
Oh, yeah. If for those of you who like to watch old movies, I play a clip from the movie 42nd Street, from 1932, which is about a Broadway play trying to make a big hit on the stage. And at one point, they've rehearsed, they're all ready to go, and the director, Warner Baxter, is yelling at them and says, "All right, what this company, you're not doing anything right. And tomorrow when we open in Philadelphia," at which point the whole chorus goes, "Philadelphia," and somebody said, "Philadelphia, PA," which is short for Pennsylvania. And then I think it's Ginger Rogers said, "Philadelphia, PU." On Sundays, it's PU, because Philadelphia was famous for having nothing was allowed to be open on Sundays. There were no plays on Sundays. There were no bars open. Nothing happened on Sundays. So for show business folk, it was a dead town.
Dead town, yeah.
Right? And that reputation maintains. However, at the same time, it was known for having this enthusiastic theater-going audience on every other night of the week. So Broadway shows began to, like the movie 42nd Street illustrate, began to send plays to Philadelphia and other cities, but Philadelphia is often the first place you'd go to for a tryout. Mm-hmm. So before a play would go to New York, it would be sent usually by the Schuberts, who were the main Broadway producers at the time, who owned a string of theaters all around the northeastern United States. But they owned most of, or controlled the leases of most major Philadelphia theaters. So it was easy to, find a space in Philadelphia, find a great house, and get a response to a play that you were trying to shape for the New York market.
Right.
If you look at almost every major play of the mid-20th century, like Death of a Salesman, Streetcar Named Desire, Diary of Anne Frank, The Miracle Worker, in terms of non-musical plays, as well as big musical plays like Anything Goes or Kiss Me Kate, Sweet Charity. All of them first had their world premiere literally in Philadelphia. I'm kind of annoying about this on social media. I'll see things posted about this play premiered at the Booth Theater in New York in 1928. And I'll write a little comment underneath, think, well, actually, it first played in Philadelphia in 1927. When I do that, everyone gets annoyed with me, rightly so. And when I lived in New York, I would have been annoyed at that Philadelphia guy who spoke up, because I'm not a native Philadelphian, I got to say. This isn't my hometown. I only got here, a couple decades ago, and this is my adopted hometown. I'm not a diehard Philadelphian, but I'm a stickler. I'm a stickler for accuracy, so I'm annoying that way. But the unwritten rule is that when a show's on tryout, when it's in a developmental run, right, out of town, and you can still rewrite things and you can still cut musical numbers, it's not really open. It's not really the finished product. It doesn't count. Noel Coward brought a play here, Sail Away, with Elaine Stritch. He got to Philadelphia and he completely rewrote the whole show. He cut a whole character. He fired the actress playing that character. He assigns all her songs to Elaine Stritch. It was sort of like what happens in Philadelphia stays in Philadelphia. It's not the real thing. We can change things as much as we want here. It's not until it gets to the Broadway house that it counts. And then we say it's opened, it's ready to go. It's the finished product. Sometimes the shows would leave New York, and one of the first places they'd come to is Philadelphia. And in fact, they would change then for the touring market. They would add new numbers. They would revamp the cast. They would revamp the production values. So Philadelphia is important in the American commercial market as well. There's a period, this tryout town period of Philadelphia theater. People still refer to it here locally because that was back in the tryout town era. So Philadelphia was regarded as a place where shows were experimented on, or would come to after they had already become hits. And there were many large, major theatrical buildings on a par with anything else in America, as many major American cities had at the time. The big touring productions would come to these big elaborate theaters, the Erlanger Theater, which was on Market Street, or the Schubert Theater, which was on Broadway, on Broad Street. We're just the same as any Broadway house. So like a lot of cities in Europe that were outside of the main capital, you'd have, big local institutions. And there was a small little theater movement. There's a little jewel box of a theater called the Plays and Players Theater, which was built back in 1911. And there was outside of the city, there was the Hedgerow Theatre Company, which I talk about a lot in my podcast, doing more artsy type of theater. And that slowly builds throughout this whole tryout town movement until we arrive at the 1980s. And at that point, and I wasn't here. I'm alive at this point. I can remember the 1980s, and I know you can too. But I was not interested in Philadelphia. I was elsewhere. My parents had gone to college here, so I was aware of it. The theater in Philadelphia was pretty moribund, and the city itself was in bad shape in the 1970s and 80s, like a lot of American cities. Still a major city, but it had lost about 500,000 people in population. It had lost a great deal of its industry. It had lost a great deal of its sort of civic oomph, as it were. It only had its sports teams, like a lot of cities in England who have been passed by, in the deindustrialization. They cling to what aspects of local pride they can. Often that's the local football team. Well, it's just like that here. But there was still this ongoing, well-trained theater audience, and a lot of people who were now coming up through university training programs and were looking to be somewhere else than New York. The regional theater movement arrives here in the mid-1960s when a director named Andre Gregory. Now, Andre Gregory was born in Paris. He's the son of Russian immigrants, very wealthy Russian immigrants. And he ends up going to Harvard, but training at East Berlin. He actually goes to the Berliner Ensemble. Yeah. And he ends up in the long run actually going to Poland and studying with Grotowski as well. So he's very European minded. And he's the one that's chosen to be the first leader of this first nonprofit theater company that's founded in Philadelphia right in the midst of this whole tryout town era. And he pretty soon, after 2 seasons, he gets in big trouble and he's kicked out because he does crazy things, and he's an egomaniac in the way all great artists are. He's a great artist. There's no doubt about it. But it begins a movement in Philadelphia that is often very influenced by the more avant-garde European theater now. Peter Brook comes through town. This is an interesting story, and I mentioned in the podcast. Peter Brook brings the RSC through Philadelphia in 1964, about the same time that Andre Gregory is helping to set up this Theater of the Living Arts. And he brings Paul Schofield, and they're doing King Lear. And this was a production that he toured throughout Europe, and it had been a big success. It was very, very Spartan, very spare, lots of big iron walls and, gray costumes. It was very stark, very, text-centered. And it completely bored the Philadelphia audience to tears. You could just tell. People were leaving. It was 3 or 4 hours long. It was the whole version. It was, it wasn't cut. And he mentions this, if you know his book, The Empty Space, Indeed. Which a lot of people read, you notice there's this passage where Peter Brook says that he noticed that this wasn't going well, and he didn't blame the people of Philadelphia. He said, no, it was us. We weren't reaching them. We weren't approaching this theatrical problem the right way. It wasn't that Philadelphia wasn't good enough to appreciate how great our art was. We weren't bringing the play to them. And I should go about it in a different way. It really is sort of a revelation to him to think about audiences' responses are worth appreciating. For meet people where they are, and you can take them to different places, but not if you condescend to them. There are theater companies which come through town. Grotowski himself comes through Philadelphia in the early 1970s with his company, and he ends up coming to America. He's got this big grant to do his play all over America, and at first they bring him to the Walnut Street Theatre, which has now been rebuilt for the third or fourth time. And it's sort of bare and stark and modern. And he's like, no, get him through here. And he ends up, somebody finds him a disused Catholic church space way in South Philadelphia, which is much more to his liking. It's got more dirt and grit to it. He ends up doing Apocalypsis cum figuris down there for an audience of just 100 people. That's all he wants. In the 1970s, interestingly, Grotowski has a lot of influence upon sort of the theater makers, people who are making theater here. There's a young company called the Manning Street Theatre Company, which I've done a lot of particular work on. I'm hoping to bring out more, whose early leading figure had actually gone to Poland to study with Grotowski. He's the guy that ends up finding Grotowski that little church in South Philly. Then later, these two Czech immigrants arrived, Jiří and Blanka Žižka from Prague. They had exiled themselves from communist Czechoslovakia because the tiny theater that they'd been working on had gotten stepped on by the government after 1968. They ended up defecting and leaving for West Germany, but they end up, for various reasons, in Philadelphia. And they join up with this radical feminist theater collective called the Wilma Project, which is sort of a Wilma as a play on William Shakespeare. What if Shakespeare had a sister named Wilma, right? Sort of an inverted version of William, but Wilma. As is the case with many young sort of cutting edge theater companies, after 3 or 4 years, the original founders run out of gas and interest, and they have fallings out. And the Žižkas essentially take over the Wilma Project, and they make it into the Wilma Theater. And over the next 30 years, they create what is essentially a Central European type theater company. And they're very interested in doing, plays by Václav Havel, and they're very interested in doing plays by Tom Stoppard. They end up having a real relationship with Tom Stoppard, who, of course, was born, in Czechoslovakia.
And yes, indeed. Yeah.
Both Havel and Stoppard end up allowing the Wilma to do many of their plays first in America. And they become a nonprofit, Actors Equity professional theater company. And they start from a very small base. They basically take over a little garage and they convert it themselves, 100 seats. Then later they have their own larger theater, which now stands on Broad Street, south of City Hall. And it's still one of the major theater companies in the city. But it comes from a very European aesthetic. And for years, it's really where plays like Our Class, which is a Polish play, was staged here, as well as plays by Gabriel Garcia Lorca are going to be staged. Well, they're probably going to be done at the Wilma. At the same time that the Žižkas have brought this new sort of Central European aesthetic to Philadelphia, and they're staging, they're doing versions of 1984 or Orwell's Animal Farm with some of their early work. The Walnut Street Theatre, which has for years been called the oldest theater in America, although it really isn't, but it has this cachet to it, is revamped, is rebuilt once again in the early 1970s. And by the early 1980s, the board, this is a very old line Philadelphia establishment institution with a lot of local money behind it, and it becomes designated an official state theater of this. They hire a man named Bernard Havard, who was at that point in Atlanta, but he's from, again, one of these old theatrical families. He's from an old British theatrical. The Havards go way back in British theater and in Belgium as well, although they had moved to Canada by that point. Bernard is very much, and still is, he still runs the theater. We're talking about a work, he's now, I think, in his 80s, but he's still running the place. He's very much of that old type of British theatrical manager. Vox populi, he always says to me, the voice of the people, Peter. We want to do what the people want to do. Although occasionally he actually did collaborate with the Žižkas at one point. They staged a joint production of Cyrano de Bergerac, of all things. A collaboration on that back in the 1990s. But on the whole, he's doing, he'll do 3 big musicals a year and then 2 non-musical plays, usually something by Oscar Wilde or Noel Coward, or they just announced their new season today for next year. They're doing Hay Fever, although right now they're about to do a production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. But it's because it's a larger space. It's 1,800 seats. They have to fill a much bigger space than the Wilma, so they are looking to bring in a whole crowd of people. Yeah. So it's interesting that these 2 types of European aesthetics are still existing here in Philadelphia today. At least I see it as a European aesthetic. Maybe that's just because of my own particular fixations. But I thought that'd be a nice way to sort of end up the story talking about European theater and Philadelphia, that I still think you can detect, even though it is now an old American city by American standards. Philadelphia is one of the older places. We can point at things that go all the way back. Down the street from me here, where I live, there's a Quaker Meeting House that goes back to 1695, right? Which to us is really ancient. I know that's not old, but
that's pretty old by anyone's standards. But
yeah, right. I'm going, okay, that 17th century Quaker Meeting House, that's a long way. So it's an older American city, and it has a pretty deep history of its own. Certainly a lot of native-born theater artists and writers, playwrights have ended up having an effect on the world scene. The fact that everything happens here in sort of a microcosm, it's a microcosm of American theatrical development. You can see the stories more clearly here. You can pick them out. They're more distinct, just because they're not happening on the huge wash of the New York stage, where there's hundreds and hundreds of stories to be talked about almost any day. I can pick them out more easily.
It certainly sounds like you have a thriving theatre scene in the city.
We do, and of course, like every place else, we're in the post-pandemic era. Mm-hmm. It's still up in the air of how things are going to develop. It's not clear, but I must say it has bounced back pretty well. Not all the way, certainly. I think if you talk to the management of local nonprofit theater companies, they would have a whole list of things they would like to point out are not going well. But comparing it to other cities, I can see around America, I think it's going fine. And there is, because Philadelphia is it's easier to live here than it is in New York. It has a long-term stable base of theater artists who are willing to work. And there's enough theater companies between the central city and then the suburban companies as well. There's enough places where, and with all the local universities here, there's enough places for people to work and support themselves and maintain a life as a ongoing theater artist, that work can continue to happen here. So I hope it's a place that will continue to be rewarding to talk about in the years to come. I'm pretty sure it will be.
My thanks to Peter for his time speaking to me, and I do hope that your appetite is whetted for more theatre history from Peter. Please do go and find his podcast, Adventures in Theatre History Philadelphia, on all the podcast apps, and enjoy the many episodes that he has already produced. That is, of course, with theatre spelt in the North American manner, ending ER. I have also put up links in the show notes and on the website guest page, and links to Peter's own website, which includes not only the audio episodes, but blog posts full of more theatre history details. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back for Season 6 of the podcast in a few months' time.